أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي ربي يسر ولا تعسر وتمم بالخير آمين يا رب العالمين.
In this lecture, we will start the study of fi'il majhul. At this time, we will briefly revise Jumla fi'liya. Jumla fi'liya has certain rules. Jumla fi'liya will always begin with fi'il. Jumla fi'liya will always have at least two parts, fi'il and fa'il. And every fi'il will always have a fa'il. So we can look at Jumla fi'liya this way. It will always start with a fi'il, and then every fi'il will always have a fa'il. Fa'il is the one performing the action. Fa'il will always be marfu. Jumla fi'liya may or may not have a maf'ul. Maf'ul is the recipient of the action, and maf'ul will always be mansub. Furthermore, fa'il can either be a personal pronoun, in which case the fa'il will be a marfu personal pronoun because fa'il will always be marfu. Or fa'il can also be shown as a noun, in which case it is called ism zahir. When fa'il is a personal pronoun, it is called ism zamir. When fa'il is a marfu personal pronoun, then any of the 14 cells from the table of Jumla fi'liya can be used. Please note that all the personal pronouns in this table are marfu personal pronouns that are used for fa'il. Huwa, huma, hum, hiya, huma, hunna, anta, antuma, antum, anti, antuma, antunna, ana, and nahnu. When fa'il is ism zahir or a noun, then we are only going to use cell number 1, for example, zahaba, or cell number 4, for example, zahabat, to make our jumla fi'liya. In the case of maf'ul, it can also be either ism zahir or a noun, or maf'ul can be a personal pronoun. And if maf'ul is a personal pronoun or ism zamir, we will need to use mansub personal pronouns because maf'ul always needs to be mansub. Mansub personal pronouns are hu, huma, hum, ha, huma, hunna, ka, kuma, kum, ki, kuma, kunna, ya, and na. Now let us move one step forward and look at the following scenarios. In scenario 1, we can say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created them. In this sentence, fa'il, that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is performing the action of creation, is clearly mentioned. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created them. The fa'il is clearly mentioned. In scenario number 2, we are saying they were created. In this case, the fa'il is obviously there, but the fa'il is not mentioned. We see examples of scenario number 2 where fa'il is obviously there but is not mentioned in the Holy Quran. Surah number 88, ayah 17 to 20. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Afala yanzuruna ilal ibili kayfa khuliqat wa ilal samai kayfa rufiat wa ilal jibali kayfa nusibat wa ilal ardi kayfa sutihat. These ayahs can be translated as follows. So, do they not look at the camels, how they are created, and at the sky, how it is raised high, and at the mountains, how they are fixed firm, and at the earth, how it is spread out? So in these 4 ayat, we are seeing a pattern. The fa'il is clearly implied, that is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but the fa'il is not mentioned. These 4 ayah clearly indicate that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is performing the action of creation of camels, of raising the sky high, of fixing the mountains, and of spreading out the earth. But the fa'il, that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is not mentioned. Inshallah, we will explore the implications of this concept in this lecture. Here are some important concepts. A fi'il in which the fa'il is not mentioned is called fi'il majhul. So this is a new terminology for us that we are introducing at this time. Once again, a fi'il in which the fa'il is not mentioned is called fi'il majhul. In fi'il majhul, the fa'il, that is the one who performs the action, is present but not mentioned. Like we studied previously, every fi'il will always have a fa'il. So in the case of fi'il majhul, the fa'il is there. Somebody or someone is performing the action, but the fa'il is not mentioned. Fi'il majhul can be considered comparable to passive voice in English grammar. Fi'il majhul is a fi'il in which the fa'il is not mentioned. The fa'il, that is, the one who performs the action, is present but not mentioned. We can revise the concept of active voice versus passive voice in English grammar. In English grammar, in the active voice, the subject performs the action of the verb. This is an example of an active voice scenario. The boy, that is the subject, performs the action. The boy, that is the subject, kicked the ball. So the boy is performing the action, the boy is the fa'il, and the boy is performing the action of kicking the ball. In passive voice, the subject receives the action. So in the passive voice scenario, the subject becomes the focus. In the active voice scenario, the performer of the action was the focus. But in the case of passive voice, the recipient of the action becomes the focus. So in the passive voice scenario, the subject, that is the ball, receives the action. In active voice, we will say the boy kicked the ball. The boy is the subject. And in passive voice, we will say the ball, which is the subject, was kicked by the boy. So the focus is now on the ball. The ball is the recipient of the action, so our focus is on the ball. Please note that we can also simply say the ball was kicked. So in this case, we are not mentioning who kicked the ball. That is, we are not mentioning the doer of the action, but our focus is on the recipient of the action, which is the ball. Once again, to consolidate the concept, in the active voice use, the focus is on the doer. The subject is the doer. And in passive voice, the focus is on the recipient of the action. The subject is the recipient of the action. So in this particular example, the focus is on the boy who is kicking the ball. In the passive voice scenario, the focus is on the ball that is being kicked. And we can either mention the doer, that is, we can say the ball was kicked by the boy, or we can choose not to mention the doer and we can simply say the ball was kicked. We are going to summarize and explain with examples when to use active voice versus passive voice. In English, active voice is typically used for clarity and directness. In active voice, the focus is on the doer or the performer of the action. For example, I ate dinner. This sentence would be very awkward if stated in the passive voice, that is, dinner was eaten by me. This is a very awkward way of saying I ate dinner. I ate dinner is very clear, I ate dinner is very direct, and I ate dinner focuses on I, that is the doer or the performer of the action. So in this type of scenario, it is best to use active voice. When do we use passive voice? Passive voice is typically used to focus on the action or its recipient, or when the doer is unknown, or when the doer is irrelevant, or simply that the doer does not necessarily need to be mentioned, or when the doer is very obvious. For example, we can say the cat was chased by the dog. Cat is the recipient of the action and the focus is on cat. Zad kicked the ball. Now, this is an example of active voice use. Zad is the doer and Zad is the subject. But we can say the ball was kicked by Zad. Now, the ball is the subject. The ball is the recipient of the action and the focus is on the ball. Or we can also say the ball was kicked. In this scenario, the doer is not mentioned. It may be obvious who kicked the ball, or it might not be relevant to know who kicked the ball, or we may not know the doer and we are just saying that the ball was kicked. So this is an example of why we would be using passive voice here. Another example is the teacher was appreciated. The focus is on the recipient of the action or the action itself. So the focus is either on the teacher, who is the recipient of the action, who would be the subject in this case, or the focus is on the action of appreciation. The doer may or may not be mentioned. So we may say that the teacher was appreciated by the students, but we can also simply say the teacher was appreciated. When we say that the teacher was appreciated by the students, we are mentioning the doer, that is, the students. But if we simply say the teacher was appreciated, then we are not mentioning the doer. Please note a very important concept. In Arabic grammar, fi'l is written differently to indicate active voice versus passive voice use. Once again, in Arabic grammar, fi'l is written differently to indicate active voice versus passive voice use. So when we are using a particular fi'l in the active voice, we will have certain rules and regulations about how to write and read that particular fi'l. And when we are using fi'l in the passive voice, we will have certain rules and regulations about how to read and write that particular fi'l. We have already studied rules and regulations for fi'l in the active voice, which we inshallah will be revising in this lecture. But we will also study how to read and write fi'l in the passive voice. Since we say that fi'l is written and read differently in active voice versus passive voice, it would be a good time to revise how fi'l is written and read in the active voice. We studied that fi'l exists in two forms of tense. We have fi'l mazi, which is fi'l in the past tense, and we have fi'l mudare, which is fi'l in the present and future tense. For both fi'l mazi and for fi'l mudare, we studied how fi'l is written and read in active voice. We further studied that in Arabic grammar, for every action, we typically require three root letters, which are called huruf-e-mada. And specific to fi'il mazi, we studied three different patterns on which fi'il mazi can be read and written. This was the fa'ula pattern, and we used the examples of qaruba, ba'uda, fa'ila pattern, and we studied the examples of fariha, armela, and the fa'ala pattern, where we studied the examples of khalaqa, ghafara. Then we studied how to construct fi'il mazi in the active voice. And for that, we focused on cell number 1 of the fi'il mazi table, or cell number 1 of the past tense table. And we came across the examples of nasara, shariba, qaruba. In these examples, we focused on the following aspects. First of all, we established that the first alphabet of cell number 1 of fi'il mazi will have zabar on it. And this is fixed. This is fixed for active voice use. We see that in nasara, we see that in shariba, and we see that in qaruba. Please also note that nasara can be translated as he helped. So in this case, the subject or the fa'il is performing the action and the fa'il is mentioned. So the focus is on the doer. Next, shariba, once again, the fa'il is mentioned. He drank. So the focus is on the fa'il. The subject is performing the action and the subject is he. Qaruba. Qaruba can be translated as he came near. And in this case, once again, the focus is on the fa'il or the doer. The subject is the fa'il and fa'il is mentioned. Next, we determined that when we are writing fi'il mazi for cell number 1, the last alphabet will always have zabar on it. So the first alphabet will have zabar on it, which is fixed for active voice use, and the last alphabet will also have zabar on it, which is fixed. The middle root letter was where we saw variance. In the case of nasara, we saw zabar on the middle root letter. In the case of shariba, we saw zair under the middle root letter. And in the case of qaruba, we saw pesh on the middle root letter. So the harkat on the middle root letter in fi'il mazi is variable, and we have to follow the Arabs in this regard. Next, we move on to fi'il mudare, and we studied how to construct fi'il mudare in active voice. We focused on cell number 1 of fi'il mudare table, and we used the example of yansuru. Yansuru can be translated as he helps or he will help, referring to the present tense and to the future tense. In the case of yansuru, first of all, we studied that fi'il mudare will start with one of the 4 signs of fi'il mudare. And these signs are ya, ta, alif, noon. And in this case, we are seeing that we are starting with ya. For cell number 1 of fi'il mudare table, we will start with ya as the sign of fi'il mudare. Next, we determined that this ya for cell number 1 will always have zabar on it. And this is fixed for active voice use. So when we are writing fi'il mudare in active voice for cell number 1 of the table, first of all, we need to bring the sign of fi'il mudare at the start, which is ya, and then we need to put zabar on that ya, and this is fixed according to a rule. Yansuru means he helps or he will help. Again, the fa'il is mentioned. Fa'il is he. The focus in active voice use is on the doer. We are not mentioning the maf'ul and we are not specifying who was helped. The focus of yansuru is on the subject, and the subject is the doer, he. In the construction of cell number 1 of fi'il mudare in active voice, we next determined that the first root letter, which is noon in this case, will always have sukoon on it. And finally, we determined that for cell number 1 of the fi'il mudare table, the last alphabet will always have pesh on it according to a rule. So we are clearly seeing that we are using a certain set of rules to write down fi'il mazi in active voice, and we are using a certain set of rules to write down fi'il mudare in the active voice. Similarly, we will also have certain rules how to write fi'il mazi in passive voice and how to write fi'il mudare in passive voice. In our study of fi'il in the active voice, we also studied patterns of fi'il mazi and the corresponding fi'il mudare. And we used certain pattern identifiers and we determined the following patterns. Karuma, yakrumu, samia, yasma'u, hasiba, yahsibu, which is less frequently used, fataha, yaftahu, dwaraba, yadribu, nasara, yansuru. So all of these patterns that we studied are applicable to fi'il mazi and fi'il mudare in active voice.
So we have the following conclusions. Fi'il mazi in the active voice is written according to a set of rules. For example, nasara, shariba, qaruba, these are all written according to certain rules. Fi'il mazi in the active voice focuses on the performance of the action by the subject or the fa'il. For example, he helped, he drank, he came near. The focus is on the fa'il and the fa'il is mentioned. In the example of nasara, he helped, he, that is the fa'il, is mentioned. Fi'il mudare, which is fi'il in the present or future tense, in the active voice is also written according to a set of rules. For example, yansuru. We studied that yansuru is written according to some rules in the active voice. Fi'il mudare in the active voice focuses on the performance of the action by the subject or the fa'il. For example, he helps or he will help. The focus is on the fa'il and the fa'il is mentioned. So in active voice, whether it is fi'il mazi or fi'il mudare, the focus will be on the fa'il, the focus will be on the doer of the action, and the fa'il will be mentioned. In English, active voice focuses on the performer of the action, that is the doer. For example, the boy kicked the ball. Here, the boy is the doer. Passive voice, on the other hand, focuses on the recipient of the action, or it focuses on the action itself. For example, the cat was chased by the dog. Here, the focus is on the cat. The cat is the recipient of the action chased. In passive voice in English, the performer of the action may or may not need to be mentioned. For example, the ball was kicked. In this scenario, the performer of the action is not mentioned. Or we can say the ball was kicked by the boy. And in this case, we are mentioning the performer of the action. With these conclusions, we can move forward and learn about some new terminologies. So the first new terminology that we learned in this lecture was that of fi'il majhul. Fi'il majhul is a fi'il in which the fa'il is not mentioned. We studied that in the active voice, whether we are looking at fi'il mazi or fi'il mudari, the fa'il is always mentioned. But fi'il majhul is a fi'il in which the fa'il is not mentioned. In fi'il majhul, the fa'il is present, but the fa'il is not mentioned. Fi'il majhul can be considered the equivalent of passive voice in English grammar. And this brings us to a new terminology, which is fi'il maruf. Just like fi'il in the passive voice in Arabic grammar is called fi'il majhul, the fi'il in the active voice is called fi'il maruf. So all the fi'il examples that we studied in fi'il mazi and all of the fi'il examples that we studied in fi'il mudari are examples of fi'il in the active voice or fi'il maruf. To summarize, in Arabic grammar, fi'il in the passive voice is called fi'il majhul and fi'il in the active voice is called fi'il maruf. One way that we classified fi'il was in terms of the tense, and we classified fi'il into fi'il mazi and fi'il mudari. Another way to classify fi'il would be fi'il in the active voice versus fi'il in the passive voice. Fi'il in the active voice is called fi'il maruf, and fi'il maruf or active voice fi'il will either be fi'il mazi or it will be fi'il mudari. We already have studied fi'il mazi and fi'il mudari in the active voice in detail. Using the example of zahaba, we studied the table of fi'il mazi as follows: zahaba, zahaba, zahabu, zahabat, zahabata, zahabna, zahabta, zahabtuma, zahabtum, zahabti, zahabtuma, zahabtunna, zahabtu, and zahabna. And similarly for fi'il mudari, zahaba in fi'il mazi became yazhabu, and our table was yazhabu, yazhabani, yazhabuna. تذهب تذهبان يذهبن تذهب تذهبان تذهبون تذهبين تذهبان تذهبن أذهب and نذهب. So all of these are examples of fi'il in the active voice or fi'il maruf. Now we come to fi'il in the passive voice or fi'il majhul. Similar to active voice fi'il, fi'il majhul or fi'il in the passive voice will also be either fi'il mazi or it will be fi'il mudari. In this lecture, we will focus our attention on the study of fi'il mazi majhul or fi'il in the past tense in the passive voice. Similar to how we constructed fi'il in the active voice, we will study the construction of fi'il in the passive voice. We have to know certain rules about passive voice fi'il or rules of fi'il majhul. The first rule is that fi'il majhul can only be constructed for a fi'il for which the maf'ul, that is the recipient of the action, is mentioned. This is an important point. In passive voice, the focus is on the recipient of the action. That is why fi'il majhul or passive voice fi'il can only be constructed for a fi'il for which the maf'ul is mentioned. So the focus is on the maf'ul, the focus is on the recipient of the action. We need to know certain terminologies here. A fi'il for which the maf'ul needs to be mentioned in order to make complete sense of the sentence is called fi'il muta'addi. Fi'il muta'addi. So fi'il muta'addi is a fi'il for which the maf'ul
needs to be mentioned in order to make complete sense of the jumla fi'liya. On the contrary, a fi'l for which mentioning the maf'ul is not needed is called fi'l lazim. So in the next slide, inshallah, we will study the distinction between fi'l muta'addi and fi'l lazim using certain examples. But for now, it is important to know the terminologies fi'l muta'addi, fi'l lazim, and to know the distinction that fi'l muta'addi will be a fi'l that requires a maf'ul to be mentioned. And the necessity for maf'ul to be mentioned is there so that we can make complete sense of the sentence. In the case of fi'l lazim, mentioning of the maf'ul is not needed. Fi'l majhul or fi'l in the passive voice can only be constructed for a fi'l for which the maf'ul, that is the recipient of the action, is mentioned. A fi'l for which the maf'ul needs to be mentioned in order to make complete sense of the sentence is called fi'l muta'addi. A fi'l for which mentioning the maf'ul is not needed is called fi'l lazim. In other words, fi'l lazim cannot be used to construct fi'l majhul. Why? Because fi'l lazim does not require the maf'ul to be mentioned. Maf'ul needs to be mentioned in the case of fi'l muta'addi in order to make complete sense of the sentence. Since the maf'ul is involved in this case, maf'ul being the recipient of the action enables us to use fi'l muta'addi to construct fi'l majhul. Let us look at the distinction between fi'l muta'addi and fi'l lazim. Fi'l muta'addi can be considered the equivalent of transitive verb in English. A verb is transitive when the action of the verb passes from the subject, that is the doer, to the direct object, which is the recipient of the action. To make complete sense, the verb requires the direct object. In other words, to make complete sense, the verb requires the maf'ul or the recipient of the action. Let us look at this example to understand fi'l muta'addi better. If we say Zaid bought, this seems incomplete. This seems incomplete without the mention of the recipient of the action. If I just say Zaid bought, then you can ask Zaid bought what? By itself, Zaid bought seems incomplete. Including a direct object will make more sense. So if I say Zaid bought the car, now the sentence makes a lot more sense. So we needed a direct object. We needed the car in this case to make complete sense of Zaid bought. So we took Zaid bought and we added the car as the recipient of the action as a direct object, and now we have Zaid bought the car. This is an example of the use of transitive verb in English. On the contrary, fi'l lazim can be considered the equivalent of an intransitive verb in English. Intransitive verbs do not need an object to make complete sense of the sentence. They have meaning on their own. For example, Zaid went. If I say Zaid went, this sentence makes sense on its own. There is no need for a direct object. Zaid himself is the recipient of the action and the action is going. So if I say Zaid bought, that seems incomplete. And using a recipient of the action provides more information. So we can say Zaid bought the car. And that is an example of the use of transitive verb. And if I say Zaid went, that by itself makes complete sense. And it does not require a direct recipient of the action. Zaid by himself is receiving the action of going. That is an example of intransitive verb or fi'l lazim. Now we will look at some more examples to simplify these concepts so that we can easily construct fi'l majhul or passive voice fi'l in Arabic grammar. We will now do some practice and we will look at each example, and for each case we will try to determine if the fi'l represents fi'l muta'addi or it represents fi'l lazim. To recall, fi'l muta'addi requires a maf'ul to complete the meaning of the sentence. And fi'il lazim does not require maf'ul to complete the meaning of the sentence. Our first example is zahaba. Zahaba can be translated as he went. Let us look into zahaba in more detail. In the case of zahaba, the doer, he, is also the recipient of the action. He went. Therefore, no direct object is needed. No maf'ul is directly needed. Now we can say he went to the house. To the house is an addition. It is in fact a prepositional phrase. It is not a direct object. If we say he went to the house is not directly receiving the action of going. The action in question is going, and it is he who is going. So we do not require a direct object, or in simple words, we can say in the case of zahaba, we do not require a maf'ul to make complete sense of the sentence. He went by itself makes sense. So our result is that this is an example of fi'il lazim, or in English we would say this is an example of an intransitive verb. Fi'il lazim is the fi'il that does not require maf'ul to complete the meaning of the sentence. Our next example is he hit, daraba. If we look into he hit in more detail, the doer, he, hits either someone or something. Who was hit or what was hit? So mentioning a recipient of the action is hit, and mentioning a recipient of the action will make more sense. So we can say he hit the ball. So in this case, we do need a maf'ul in order to complete the meaning of the sentence, and therefore this is an example of fi'il muta'addi or transitive verb. Our third example is shariba. He drank. We can ask, the doer drank something. What did he drink? Mentioning a recipient of the action will make more sense. We can say he drank the tea. So in this case, we do have a direct object or maf'ul that is the recipient of the action. The tea is being consumed. This is an example of fi'il muta'addi or transitive verb. Next we have he helped, nasira. Again, the doer helped someone. Who was helped? Mentioning a recipient of the action will make more sense. We can say he helped Zaid. So in this example, a direct object or a direct recipient can receive the action of help. This is also an example of fi'il muta'addi or a transitive verb. Finally, he slept. If we pay attention to he slept, the doer, that is he, is also the recipient of the action. It is he who is sleeping. He is not transferring the action of sleeping onto someone or something else. No direct object is needed. We can say he slept on the bed, but on the bed is an addition. It is a prepositional phrase. It is not a direct object. The bed is not directly receiving the action of sleeping. The action that we are discussing is sleeping, and the doer is the one who is also receiving the action. So we do not need maf'ul to make more sense of the sentence. He slept by itself makes complete sense. So this will be an example of fi'il lazim or intransitive verb. A very useful clue that we can use to identify whether a fi'il is fi'il muta'addi or fi'il lazim is to use the who or what test. If a fi'il raises a possible question, who was the action performed on or what was the action performed on, then generally that fi'il can be considered fi'il muta'addi or a transitive verb, meaning that that fi'il muta'addi can then be used to make fi'il majhul or passive voice fi'il. Let us look at this table again, and now we are going to use the who or the what test. So now we have the same table. and we have added another example of he spoke. And we are going to apply the who or what test to the fi'il and see if that helps us easily identify whether a fi'il is transitive or intransitive. In other words, if a fi'il is muta'addi or a fi'il is fi'il lazim. Zahaba, he went. Can who or what be applied to the fi'il? In the case of zahaba, no. We cannot ask he went what or he went who. So the who or what test does not apply. Therefore, this is fi'il lazim or intransitive verb, meaning that this fi'il cannot be used to make fi'il majhul or passive voice fi'il. Daraba, he hit. Can who or what be applied to this fi'il? Yes. Who was hit? What was hit? The fi'il raises questions. Something can be hit or someone can be hit. Somebody or something can receive the action. Somebody or something can be the maf'ul. Therefore, this is an example of fi'il muta'addi or a transitive verb, meaning that this fi'il can be used to make fi'il majhul or passive voice fi'il. Shariba, he drank. Can the who or what test be applied to this fi'il? Yes. We can ask, what did he drink? This is an example of fi'il muta'addi or transitive verb. This fi'il can be used to make passive voice fi'il or fi'il majhul. He helped. Can the who or what test be applied to this fi'il? Yes. We can ask, who was helped? Once again, this is fi'il muta'addi or transitive verb. He slept. Can the who or what test be applied to he slept? No. We cannot ask he slept who or he slept what. He slept does not need a maf'ul. Therefore, this is an example of fi'il lazim. This fi'il cannot be used to make passive voice fi'il or fi'il majhul. He spoke. Can the who or what test be applied to this fi'il? Yes. We can ask, what did he speak? The result? This is fi'il muta'addi or transitive verb. So we use this clue successfully to ask ourselves the who or what question for a series of examples of fi'il, and if we are able to answer either the who question or the what question, then generally that fi'il can be considered fi'il muta'addi or a transitive verb, and the implication is that we can use that particular fi'il to make fi'il majhul or passive voice fi'il. For example, in the passive voice, we can say, words were spoken by him. Zad was helped by him. Water was consumed by him. The wall was hit by him. So these are examples of fi'il muta'addi where there is a role of the maf'ul, and that is why we can construct fi'il in the passive voice using fi'il muta'addi. So these are the final rules of fi'il majhul or passive voice fi'il. Number one, fi'il majhul can only be constructed for a fi'il for which the maf'ul is mentioned. Fi'il majhul can only be constructed for a fi'il for which the recipient of the action is mentioned. A fi'il for which maf'ul needs to be mentioned in order to make complete sense of the sentence is called fi'il muta'addi. And a fi'il for which mentioning the maf'ul is not needed is called fi'il lazim. Point number two, fi'il majhul can only be constructed from fi'il muta'addi, that is, transitive verb. Fi'il majhul cannot be constructed from fi'il lazim, which is comparable to intransitive verb. So if we come across fi'il lazim, we cannot use it to construct fi'il in the passive voice or fi'il majhul. But if we come across fi'il muta'addi, we can use it to construct fi'il majhul or fi'il in the passive voice. A simple example is that if we come across zahaba, he went, that is an example of fi'il lazim, and we cannot use zahaba to make fi'il majhul. But if we come across an example, shariba, that is an example of fi'il muta'addi, and we can use that fi'il to make fi'il majhul or the passive voice fi'il. Next, we will learn how to construct fi'il majhul. We will use the example of nasara. Nasara is fi'il mazi, but most importantly, nasara is fi'il mazi in the active voice. Nasara is an example of fi'il maruf. Nasara can be translated as he helped. Clearly, he is the focus here, the fa'il is the focus here, the fa'il is mentioned, so this is an example of fi'il in the active voice. In order to convert this fi'il into the passive voice, the first question we have to ask ourselves is this fi'il muta'addi? Is this a transitive verb or is it fi'il lazim or intransitive verb? We will go back to our table and we will use certain examples and we will apply the who or the what test. Nasara, he helped. Apply the who or what test. It applies. We can use a maf'ul as a direct recipient of the action. Therefore, nasara is fi'il muta'addi, and yes, it can be used to make fi'il majhul. Zahaba, he went. Apply the who or what test. We cannot ask he went who or he went what. Therefore, it does not apply. Therefore, this is not a fi'il muta'addi, and no, it cannot be used to make fi'il majhul. Sami'a, he heard. Apply the who or what test. What did he hear? This is fi'il muta'addi, and yes, it can be used to make fi'il majhul. Shariba, he drank. Apply the who or what test. What did he drink? It applies. This is fi'il muta'addi, and it can be used to make fi'il majhul or fi'il in the passive voice. Qadima, he arrived. Apply the who or what test. We cannot ask he arrived what or he arrived who. That doesn't make any sense. So the test does not apply. Therefore, this is not fi'il muta'addi and it cannot be used to make fi'il majhul. So at this point, we have concluded that nasara is fi'il muta'addi. It can be used to make fi'il majhul. We successfully applied the who or what test to nasara. We figured out that yes, there can be a maf'ul that can be a direct recipient of the action of help. Therefore, it is fi'il muta'addi, it is a transitive verb, and it can be used to make fi'il majhul. We will continue with our construction of fi'il majhul. In step number 1, we determined that nasara can be used to make fi'il majhul because it is fi'il muta'addi. In step number 2, we will need to write down the root letters of Noon, Swat, Ra. In our third step, we will need to add zabar on the last root letter. Please note that this is the same rule that we applied in active voice fi'il as well. So in the case of nasara, we put a zabar on the last alphabet according to a fixed rule. And a similar rule applies in the case of construction of fi'il majhul as well. In step number 4, we will put a pesh on the first root letter. This is specific to the construction of fi'il majhul. This is a very important distinction to note in the construction of fi'il majhul versus fi'il maruf. In the case of construction of active voice, we put a zabar on the first root letter. But in the case of construction of fi'il majhul or passive voice fi'il, we will need to put a pesh on the first root letter. So now we have a pesh on the first root letter, we have a zabar on the last root letter, and we are left with the middle root letter. Please recall that in the case of fi'il mazi in the active voice, we could use zabar, we could use zair, or we could use pesh. And for that, we needed to depend on how the Arabs used it. But in the case of fi'il majhul, the middle root letter will always have zair underneath it. So this is fixed in the case of fi'il majhul, but in the case of fi'il maruf or active voice fi'il in the past tense, we could use zabar, zair or pesh on the middle root letter. So already we can tell that there is a certain method to how we construct fi'il majhul, that is fi'il in the passive voice, which is different than how we constructed fi'il mazi and fi'il mudare in the active voice. Please also note that at this time, we are only working on the construction of fi'il majhul in the past tense. So, nasara is an example of fi'il maruf or active voice fi'il in the past tense. Nusira is passive voice fi'il or fi'il majhul in the past tense. So, our final conclusion or the final result is nasara becomes nusira. Nasara, he helped. Nasara is an example of fi'il mazi and nasara is in the active voice. Nusira, he was helped. Nusira is also an example of fi'il mazi. However, nusira is used in the passive voice. We can conclude that nasara is fi'il mazi ma'ruf or active voice past tense fi'il. Nusira is fi'il mazi majhul or passive voice fi'il in the past tense. Nasara means he helped. Nusira means he was helped. In the case of Nasara, the focus is on the fa'il, he. In the case of Nusira, the focus is on the maf'ul. The focus is on the recipient of the action. The focus is on the maf'ul and the fa'il is not mentioned. So at this point, we have constructed our first passive voice fi'il or our first fi'il majhul. We used nasara to construct nusira. Nasara is fi'il mazi. Nusira is also fi'il mazi. Nasara is active voice fi'il. Nusira is passive voice fi'il or fi'il majhul. Nasara being active voice fi'il can also be called fi'il maruf. Please note a very important concept here. Nasara equals fi'il plus fa'il, and the fa'il we know will always be marfu, and in the case of nasara, fa'il is the marfu personal pronoun huwa. What about nusira? By definition, nusira has the fi'il and the maf'ul, he was helped. So we have the recipient of the action and we have the fi'il as well. Please also note that the fa'il does perform the action. The fa'il is present. Somebody is helping, but the fa'il is not mentioned. Since the fa'il is not mentioned, the maf'ul will no longer be called maf'ul, but we will call it the acting fa'il. Fa'il is there, but it is not mentioned, so we will take the maf'ul and we will call it the acting fa'il. In other words, since the fa'il is not mentioned, the maf'ul is given the status of fa'il. This is a very important concept. In passive voice fi'il, the fa'il is not mentioned. The fa'il is performing the action, but the fa'il is not mentioned. Since the fa'il is not mentioned, the maf'ul is given the status of fa'il, and the maf'ul is called the acting fa'il. So in the case of nasara, we had a clear fa'il. The fa'il was present, the fa'il is mentioned, the fa'il is performing the action, and the fa'il in the case of nasara is huwa. In the case of nusira, the fa'il is performing the action, but the fa'il is not mentioned. Since the fa'il is not mentioned, the maf'ul is given a promotion and it is given the status of fa'il, and we will call it the acting fa'il. We will not call it the maf'ul anymore. We will call it the acting fa'il. In the case of nasara, the fa'il was huwa, and in the case of nusira, the acting fa'il will also be huwa. We will summarize our concepts here. Active voice fi'il is called fi'il maruf, and fi'il in the active voice can be fi'il mazi or it can be fi'il mudari, and fi'il in the active voice will have fi'il plus fa'il, that is the doer or the performer of the action, plus minus maf'ul. Maf'ul is the recipient of the action. Fa'il will always be marfu, maf'ul will always be mansub. Fi'il in the passive voice or passive voice fi'il is also called fi'il majhul. in the case of passive voice fi'il, the fa'il is not mentioned. Fi'il majhul will have the following components. It will have the fi'il, similar to active voice, but it will have the acting fa'il. What is the acting fa'il? The acting fa'il was originally the maf'ul. The acting fa'il was originally the recipient of the action, which has been given the status of fa'il. Why is it given the status of fa'il? Since fa'il is not mentioned in passive voice fi'il, the maf'ul is given the status of fa'il. Please note that the acting fa'il is also marfu. So fa'il in the case of active voice fi'il or fa'il in the case of fi'il maruf is always marfu, and acting fa'il in the case of passive voice fi'il or acting fa'il in the case of fi'il majhul is also marfu. Now we will do some practice and we will compare tables of fi'il in the active voice versus fi'il in the passive voice. We are very familiar with this table already. This is table for fi'il mazi, that is fi'il in the past tense in the active voice. This table starts with nasara, and in the case of nasara, the fa'il is mentioned. He helped. Now let us look at the table for passive voice. This table starts with nusira, and we already did the conversion from nasara to nusira. Nusira is an example of fi'il mazi in the passive voice. Nasara, he helped. Nusira, he was helped. Both are referring to the past tense, but this is an active voice where the fa'il is mentioned, and nusira is in passive voice where the fa'il is not mentioned. The focus is on the maf'ul. He was helped. Nasara, they, dual masculine, helped. Nusira, they, masculine dual, were helped. Nasaru, they helped. Nusiru, they were helped. Nasarat, she helped. Nusirat, she was helped. Nasarata, they helped, referring to feminine and dual. Nusirata, they were helped, referring to feminine and dual number. Nasarna, they helped. Nusirna, they were helped. Nasarta, you helped. Nusirta, you were helped. Nasartuma, you too helped. Nusirtuma, you too were helped. Nasartum, you helped. Nusirtum, you were helped. Nasarti, referring to the feminine gender. Nusirti, you were helped, referring to the feminine gender. Nasartuma, you too helped. Nusirtuma, you too were helped. Nasartunna, you helped. Nusirtunna, you were helped, referring to feminine and plural. Nasartu, I helped. Nusirtu, I was helped. Nasarna, we helped. Nusirna, we were helped. This shows how important it is to pay attention to harakat at the start of a fi'il because it can completely change the meaning. Nasartu means I helped. Nusirtu means I was helped. We will repeat the table for passive voice. Nusira, nusira, nusiru. Nusirat, nusirata, nusirna. Nusirta, nusirtuma, nusirtum. Nusirti, nusirtuma, nusirtunna. Nusirtu, nusirna. Our next active voice fi'il is khalaqa. Khalaqa is active voice fi'il in the past tense. Khalaqa means he made or he created. Please note that the fa'il in each case is highlighted, and we see that fa'il are marfu personal pronouns. For us to convert khalaqa into the passive voice, first of all, we have to see if that conversion is possible or not. We will apply the who or what test to khalaqa, and khalaqa passes the who or what test. We can ask who was created or what was created. This means that khalaqa is fi'il muta'addi. It is a transitive verb, therefore it can be used to make fi'il majhul. And our fi'il majhul is khuliqa. Khuliqa is in the passive voice and khuliqa is fi'il mazi. Our table for khuliqa will be as follows. Khuliqa, he was created or it was created. Clearly, we see that the meaning is in the passive voice. Khuliqa, khuliqu, khuliqat, khuliqata, khuliqna, khuliqta, khuliqtuma, khuliqtum, khuliqti, khuliqtuma, khuliqtunna, khuliqtu, khuliqna, khuliqtu, I was created. In the active voice, we will say khalaqtu, I made or I created. Please also note that in the passive voice, we are going to have acting fa'il, and the acting fa'il will also be marfu, similar to how the fa'il was marfu in our table of fi'il mazi in the active voice. Khuliqa can be translated as he was created. We have the mention of the action, that is creation, and we have he, which originally is the maf'ul, but we studied that in the passive voice, the maf'ul will be given the status of fa'il and then it will be called acting fa'il. So we have acting fa'il in khuliqa, that is huwa. And for the rest of the table, we will continue to use marfu personal pronouns. Huwa, huma, hum, hiya, huma, hunna, anta, antuma, antum, anti, antuma, antunna, ana, and nahnu. The difference is that in the case of active voice, the fa'il is mentioned. But in the passive voice, the fa'il is not mentioned, so we are using acting fa'il. Our next fa'il in the active voice is rafa'a. Rafa'a can be translated as he raised. In order to make fi'il majhul from rafa'a, first of all, we have to apply the who or what test. Rafa'a passes the who or what test. We can ask, what was raised? Rafa'a is fi'il muta'addi or transitive verb, and it can be used to make fi'il majhul. And our fi'il majhul will be rufi'a, and our table will be as follows. رفع رفع رفعوا رفعت رفعتا رفعنا رفعت رفعتما رفعتم رفعتي رفعتما رفعتن رفعت رفعنا. رفع can be translated as he was raised or it was raised. Our next fi'il is nasaba. Nasaba is in the active voice and nasaba means he established. In order to make the passive voice fi'il, we will apply the who or what test. Nasaba passes the test. We can ask who was established or what was established. So nasaba is an example of fi'il muta'addi. It is a transitive verb and it can be used to make fi'il majhul. Nasaba is an example of fi'il mazi maruf or active voice fi'il, and it can be translated as he set up, that is he erected or he established. The corresponding fi'il majhul will be nusiba. Nasaba, nusiba. Our table will be as follows. Nusiba, nusiba, nusibu, nusibat, nusibata, nusibna, nusibta, nusibtuma, nusibtum, nusibti, nusibtuma, nusibtunna, nusibtu, nusibna. Nasaba, he established. Nusiba, he was established or it was established. The next fi'il is satwaha. Satwaha can be translated as he flattened or he spread out. Sataha is a fi'il mazi maruf or fi'il in the active voice, and the meaning is he spread out or he flattened. Sataha passes the who or what test. We can ask what was flattened or what was spread out. So sataha is a fi'il muta'addi or a transitive verb, and it can be used to make fi'il majhul. The fi'il majhul for sataha will be suteha. Suteha can be translated as it was flattened or it was spread out. Suteha, suteha, sutehu, sutehat, sutehata, sutehna, sutehta, sutehtuma, sutehtum, sutehti, sutehtuma, sutehtunna, sutehtu, sutehna. We will now return to the 4 ayat that we studied at the beginning of the lecture. These ayat are from Surah number 88, number 17 to 20. In ayah number 70, we see the following translation. So, do they not look at the camels, how they are created? If we pay attention, we will see that in this translation, the fa'il is not mentioned. The fa'il is obvious that the ayah is referring to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creating the camels, but the fa'il is not mentioned. So the clue is that in this ayah, at some point, we will see the use of fi'il majhul, and we see that in the form of khuliqat. Khuliqat is fi'il mazi majhul, or fi'il in the past tense passive voice. Khuliqat comes from cell number 4 of our table. The table started with khuliqa, khuliqa, khuliqu, khuliqat. Why are we using cell number 4? Please recall that al-ibli, that is used for the camels, is plural. And we studied previously that for the plural of ghair aqil asma, we will use a pronoun that is singular and feminine. So we will choose cell number 4 that is used for singular and feminine, and we will pick khuliqat. Please note that in the case of khuliqat, the acting fa'il is hiya. In the next ayah, we have the following translation. And at the sky, how it is raised high. Once again, the fa'il is not mentioned. The fa'il is performing the action, but is not mentioned. The ayah is clearly referring to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala raising the sky high. So we will look for passive voice fa'il in the ayah, and that is rufi'at. Rufi'at is fi'il mazi majhul, that is past tense passive voice fi'il. Rufi'at also comes from cell number 4 of the table, which is singular and feminine. Why are we using cell number 4? We should recall that as-sama'i is feminine in gender. That is why we are using singular and feminine. Acting fa'il in the case of rufi'at is also ya. In the next ayah, we see, and the mountains, how they are fixed firm. Again, there is no mention of the fa'il. And in this ayah, the passive voice fa'il that is used for fixing the mountains firm is nusibat. Nusibat is fi'il mazi majhul, that is past tense passive voice fi'il. Again, nusibat comes from cell number 4 of the table, which is used for singular and feminine. Why are we using cell number 4? Al-jibali, that is the mountains, is plural, and for the plural of ghair aqil ism, we will use singular and feminine pronoun. So we will choose cell number 4 from our table, that is nusibat. In the case of nusibat, we will not mention the fa'il, but we will mention the acting fa'il, and the acting fa'il in the case of nusibat is hiya. And in ayah number 20, we see, and at the earth, how it is spread out. There is no mention of the fa'il, but there is the mention of the earth being spread out. And the passive voice fa'il for that is sutehat. Sutehat is past tense passive voice fa'il. Sutehat comes from cell number 4 of the table, again referring to singular and feminine. And we should recall that al-ardi is feminine in gender. The acting fa'il in the case of sutehat is also hiya.
سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك